You are about to meet your future spouse. The year is approximately 1200. You are the eldest son of a minor English baron, not wealthy enough to be a major political player, not poor enough to be irrelevant, occupying the specific middle ground of the medieval aristocracy, where the management of land and the management of alliances were the two primary occupations of adult life. You have been told that you are to be married. You have also been told to whom. The name is familiar. It is, in fact, very familiar. The person you are being married to is someone you have met at family gatherings, whose parents are people your parents know extremely well, whose family tree, if you were to draw it out, would converge with your own family tree in ways that the modern person looking at that diagram would find somewhat alarming. Your future spouse is your cousin, possibly your second cousin, possibly something that the medieval genealogical tradition would describe as being in the third or fourth degree of consanguinity, which sounds like a technical legal term, but is essentially the church's way of categorizing how closely related to each other two people are. You are not alarmed. Your parents are not alarmed. The priest who will eventually perform the ceremony is not, in this particular case, alarmed, because in the medieval world, marrying your cousin was not the shocking, taboo-laden thing that the modern person's cultural framework makes it. It was, depending on the specific circumstances, either perfectly normal, strategically advantageous, legally complicated, or all three simultaneously. This script is about consanguinity, the legal and canonical term for blood relationship, from the Latin consanguinitas, same blood, and its extraordinary, complicated, sometimes spectacular role in the medieval world. It is about the rules that the medieval church developed for managing who could marry whom based on their degree of relatedness. It is about the spectacular ways in which the medieval nobility violated those rules, and the equally spectacular negotiations they undertook to make the violations retrospectively acceptable. It is about the genuine biological reality of the small, isolated inbreeding communities that the medieval village structure produced. And it is about the specific, fascinating, occasionally eye-watering cases in which the consanguinity rules and the political realities of the medieval world collided in ways that produced some of the most extraordinary dynastic situations in European history. The medieval relationship with consanguinity is a subject that requires the specific combination of the historical, the legal, the genetic, and the genealogical to fully understand. It also requires a certain tolerance for family trees that loop back on themselves in ways that the diagram software struggles to represent. Let's start with the rules, because the rules were complicated. And the rules being complicated was not an accident. Chapter 1. The rules. What the church said about marrying your relatives, and why the rules kept changing. The church had opinions about consanguinity. Strong opinions. Evolving opinions. Opinions that changed sufficiently over the course of the medieval period that what was permissible in the 9th century was prohibited in the 12th century, and what was prohibited in the 12th century was modified in the 13th century in ways that made the whole system slightly more manageable for the nobility that had been finding the 12th century rules essentially impossible to comply with. The fundamental principle was simple. People who were too closely related could not marry. The complexity was entirely in the definition of too closely related. The biblical basis for the incest prohibition, the specific list of prohibited relationships in Leviticus 18 and 20 that the Old Testament provided, was the starting point. And it prohibited relationships that everyone, from the most conservative to the most liberal medieval theologian, agreed were genuinely problematic. parent and child, brother and sister, the direct lineal relationships, where the biological closeness was obvious, and the social consequences of violation were severe. But the medieval church did not stop at the biblical list. The church extended the prohibition through the canon law that the medieval church was developing as one of its most important intellectual projects, to cover relationships that the biblical text didn't specifically address. The key development was the adoption of the Germanic counting system for degrees of consanguinity, rather than the Roman counting system that the classical law had used. This sounds like a technical administrative detail, and it is, but the specific technical detail had extraordinary practical consequences for who could and could not legally marry whom. Under the Roman counting system, the system that the classical Roman law had used, the degree of consanguinity between two people was calculated by counting the steps in the family tree between them. Parent and child were in the first degree, siblings were in the second degree, first cousins were in the fourth degree. Under this system, the prohibition on marriage extended to the sixth degree, meaning sixth cousins were at the edge of the prohibited zone. Under the Germanic counting system, the system that the medieval canon law adopted, the calculation was different. Instead of counting the total number of steps between the two people, you counted the number of generations back to the common ancestor. Parent and child were in the first degree. Siblings were in the first degree. They share parents who are one generation back. First cousins were in the second degree. They share grandparents who are 2 generations back, and so on. The seventh degree in the Germanic system, the prohibition that the Lateran Council of 1059 extended the defied marriage prohibition to, was the 7th generation of the family tree, meaning that the prohibition on marriage extended to people who shared a common ancestor going back 7 generations. 7 generations back is approximately 128 great-great-great-great-grandparents, and the person in the 7th degree of consanguinity from you is someone whose relationship to you requires a 7-generation genealogy to establish. The practical consequence of this rule for the medieval noble class, whose genealogies were the most carefully maintained and whose marriage options were the most politically constrained, was devastating. In a small aristocratic community where everyone was related to everyone else through the various marriages of the preceding generations, finding a marriage partner who was not within 7 degrees of consanguinity was essentially impossible. The genealogies that the medieval noble families maintained, the specific documentation of the family tree, that the consanguinity rules made a legal necessity, were the specific evidence that made the prohibited relationship visible and therefore legally actionable. This was not entirely an accident. The canon law scholars of the medieval church were not stupid, and the elaboration of the consanguinity rules to a degree that made compliance effectively impossible for the nobility was not a naive oversight. The consanguinity dispensation, the specific papal or episcopal permission to marry someone within the prohibited degrees, was the specific tool that the elaborated rules created and that the church could offer in exchange for the specific considerations that the granting of the dispensation required. The dispensation was power. The power to permit the marriage that the rules would otherwise prohibit was the power to enable the alliances that the nobility needed and to extract the consideration, financial, political, ecclesiastical, that the church required in exchange. The elaborated consanguinity rules were the medieval church's specific leverage over the marriage market of the aristocracy, and the dispensation system was the specific mechanism through which that leverage was converted into concrete institutional benefits. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215, the great church council that Pope Innocent III convened, and that produced some of the most important canonical legislation of the medieval period, addressed the consanguinity rules with the specific pragmatism of an institution that had noticed that the existing rules were producing more dispensation requests than the administrative system could reasonably process. The council reduced the prohibited degrees from the 7th to the 4th, from the 7th generation of the family tree to the 4th, meaning that 4th cousins and beyond could now marry without requiring a dispensation. This was a significant relaxation. The reduction from the 7th to the 4th degree dramatically reduced the range of relationships that required the dispensation, making the rules both more enforceable and more administratively manageable. But the 4th degree still prohibited the marriage of first cousins, 2nd degree, second cousins, 3rd degree, and 3rd cousins, 4th degree, without dispensation, maintaining the church's leverage over the nobility's most common and most politically important marriage decisions. The affinity rules were the consanguinity rules extended to cover the relationships created by marriage, as well as the relationships created by blood. The medieval church treated marriage as creating a spiritual kinship between the families involved that was equivalent, for the purposes of the consanguinity calculation, to actual blood relationship. If you married someone, your spouse's relatives became your relatives in the canonical sense, and the subsequent marriages of your children to the children of your spouse's siblings were therefore within the prohibited degrees of affinity rather than of consanguinity. The spiritual kinship created by the godparent relationship, the specific bond between the godparent and the godchild, and between the godparent and the godchild's parents, was another extension of the kinship rules that the medieval canon law developed. The godparent was, in canonical terms, a spiritual parent, and the prohibition on marriage between the godparent and the godchild, or between the godparent and the godchild's parent, was the specific rule that the spiritual kinship created. The practical consequence of the affinity and spiritual kinship rules, added to the consanguinity rules, was a system of marriage prohibition that was genuinely comprehensive, covering the blood relationships, the relationships created by marriage, and the relationships created by religious ritual, and that in the small interconnected communities of the medieval world was genuinely difficult to navigate without either careful planning or regular recourse to the dispensation system. Chapter 2: The Village: How Ordinary Medieval People Actually Ended Up Marrying Their Relatives. The village was small. This is the starting point for understanding the consanguinity situation of the medieval ordinary person, not the nobility with their elaborate genealogies and their strategic marriage alliances, but the peasant in the village who was trying to find a spouse within the constraints of geography, economics, and the canon law that they may have understood imperfectly, but that the local priest was supposed to enforce on the church's behalf. The medieval English village, to take the example that the historical record provides most detail about, was a community of perhaps 200 to 500 people, representing perhaps 40 to 100 households. These were the people who lived within walking distance of each other, who worked the same fields, who worshipped in the same church, who attended the same market, and who were therefore the most immediately available pool of potential marriage partners. The specific demography of the village produced the specific consanguinity situation of the medieval poor. 200 people in a single community across 4 to 5 generations produced a specific pattern of interrelatedness that the mathematical analysis of village genealogies has confirmed. In the stable, relatively closed village community of the medieval period, Virtually everyone was related to virtually everyone else, within the 7-degree limit that the pre-1215 canon law prohibited. The historical demographer's analysis of the Halesowen court rolls, one of the most intensively studied medieval English village records, has produced exactly this picture. By tracing the genealogies of the village families through the medieval period, the researchers found that the majority of marriages in the village involved some degree of a consanguinity, often without the couple or the officiating priest being aware of the specific relationship. The consanguinity was present because it was the statistical inevitability of the small, relatively stable community where the same families had been intermarrying for generations. The awareness of the consanguinity was the specific variable that determined whether the canon law was triggered. The Church's approach to the consanguinity prohibition was not the approach of the systematic genealogical investigator. The Church did not employ genealogists to trace the family trees of the couples presenting themselves for marriage and identify the prohibited relationships. The Church relied on the announcement of the banns, the proclamation of the intended marriage, in the church on 3 consecutive Sundays before the ceremony, to give anyone who knew of a canonical impediment, including a consanguinity, the opportunity to raise it. In the village where everyone knew everyone's business, the announcement of the banns was the specific mechanism for identifying the consanguinity that the couple or the priest had missed. The neighbor who knew that the groom's grandfather and the bride's grandmother were siblings, the specific genealogical fact that put the couple in the prohibited degree, was the specific source of the consanguinity challenge that the ban system was designed to elicit. But the neighbor who knew this, and who also knew that the couple were good people, that the marriage was appropriate in every other respect, and that raising the canonical challenge would disrupt a perfectly reasonable social arrangement. This neighbor might choose not to raise the challenge. The specific social pressure of the small community, where the raising of the canonical impediment would damage the challenger's relationship with both families involved, was the specific factor that moderated the theoretical efficiency of the ban system. The result was a system in which the consanguinity prohibition was enforced selectively, raised when there was a specific reason to challenge the marriage, rivalry between families, desire to invalidate a marriage that had proven inconvenient, genuine piety, and overlooked when there was no specific reason to pursue it. The medieval village's management of the consanguinity rules was the pragmatic management of rules that the demographic reality of the small community made impossible to comply with perfectly. The dispensation for the ordinary person was theoretically available, but practically inaccessible. The dispensation process required a petition to the bishop, the bishop's consideration of the petition, and the payment of the fee that the dispensation required. The fee for a consanguinity dispensation was not trivial. It was designed for the nobility, for whom the dispensation was a necessary part of the marriage market's management, not for the peasant whose modest resources made the bishop's fee a significant obstacle. The ordinary person's response to the discovered consanguinity was therefore not typically the formal dispensation. It was more commonly the informal management of the situation, the specific combination of looking the other way, of the local priest's judgment about how strictly to enforce a rule that the community's demography made effectively unenforceable, and occasionally of the post hoc regularization that the discovery of the consanguinity after the marriage had been celebrated required. The post hoc regularization, the dispensation granted after the marriage had already happened and the consanguinity had been discovered, was common enough to have its own canonical tradition. The Church recognized that the insistence on invalidating a marriage that had been validly conducted from every other perspective, that had produced children, that had established the social and economic arrangements of two families, on the grounds of a consanguinity that had not been known at the time of the marriage, was both socially disruptive and pastorally problematic. The retrospective dispensation was the canonical solution, normalizing the marriage post hoc in exchange for the appropriate acknowledgement of the transgression and the appropriate fee. The specific case of the medieval village's consanguinity situation illuminates a general principle about the relationship between the canon law's theoretical requirements and the practical reality of medieval life. The law was the law, and the law was enforced, but the enforcement was selective, negotiated, and mediated by the specific social, economic, and pastoral considerations of the local situation. The canon law was not a mechanical system that operated identically regardless of context. It was a framework that the specific agents of the church applied with the specific judgment about what the particular situation required. Chapter 3. The Nobility. Cousins marrying. Cousins, and the strategic logic of aristocratic inbreeding. You are a medieval king with a problem. The problem is not unusual. It is, in fact, the permanent condition of medieval kingship, varying only in its specific manifestation at any given moment. The problem is alliance, the specific constant existential requirement of the medieval monarch to maintain the network of alliances that kept the kingdom stable, the neighbors cooperative, and the internal nobility manageable, was the organizing problem of medieval dynastic politics. And marriage was the primary tool that the medieval monarch had for addressing it. The marriage alliance was the specific mechanism through which the medieval political system translated relationships between kingdoms and noble houses into the personal, familial, legally binding connection that the alliance required. When the English king married his daughter to the French duke, he was not merely creating a personal relationship between two individuals. He was creating a specific, institutionalized, legally enforceable connection between two political entities, with the specific obligations and the specific constraints that the marriage's dynastic implications created. The problem with using marriage as the primary alliance tool was that the number of available appropriate marriage partners was severely limited. The appropriate partner for the king's daughter was not any man who might present himself. It was a man of appropriate rank, appropriate political significance, appropriate religion, and appropriate availability. In the medieval European political system, the number of individuals who met all these criteria was genuinely small, and the marriages that the system's requirements demanded had to be drawn from this small pool of available candidates repeatedly across the generations. The consequence was inevitable: the repeated marriage between the same noble families across multiple generations produced the specific genealogical situation in which the noble families of Europe were comprehensively related to each other in multiple overlapping ways. The Habsburg family tree of the later medieval and early modern period is the most spectacularly documented example of this process. The specific genealogical diagram that shows the Habsburg marriages across several centuries produces the looping, self-referential structure of the family tree that has become the shorthand for the extremes of dynastic inbreeding. But the Habsburgs were not an anomaly. They were the most extreme example of a pattern that was universal among the medieval European nobility. The consanguinity dispensation was the specific tool that made this system work, despite the canon law's prohibition. The papal dispensation, the specific permission from the Pope or the Pope's delegate to marry within the prohibited degrees, was the mechanism that the nobility used to reconcile the political necessity of the cousin marriage with the canonical prohibition on it. The dispensation was expensive in the sense of requiring the specific political and financial consideration that the papal court charged for the service, but the political necessity of the marriage typically justified the expense. The specific process of obtaining the dispensation was a diplomatic exercise as much as an administrative one. The petition to the Pope required the formal argument for why the specific marriage was necessary, despite the consanguinity, the political alliance it would create, the peace it would secure, the specific harm that the prohibition of the marriage would cause. The papal court considered the argument, evaluated the political considerations, assessed the fees, and issued the dispensation that permitted the marriage to proceed. The dispensation was not guaranteed. The Pope could and did refuse dispensation in specific cases where the political considerations favored refusal, where the marriage would create an alliance that the papacy found inconvenient, where the parties requesting the dispensation were in bad standing with Rome for other reasons, where the political calculus of the specific moment made the refusal more useful to the papacy than the granting. The dispensation system was not merely an administrative process, it was a political one, and the Pope's control over the dispensation was the Pope's specific leverage over the marriage alliances of the European nobility. The case of Henry VIII of England, who wanted to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon on grounds that included the argument that the marriage was invalid because Catherine had been previously married to Henry's brother Arthur, is the most famous example of the papal dispensation becoming a political crisis. Catherine and Henry had required a dispensation from Pope Julius II to marry in the first place, because Catherine's previous marriage to Henry's brother created the affinity impediment that the canon law prohibited. Julius II had granted the dispensation. Henry now wanted Clement VII to rule that Julius's dispensation had been improperly granted and that the marriage was therefore invalid. Clement VII's specific problem was that Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, whose army was currently occupying Rome and whose political influence over the papacy was, in the year 1527, essentially absolute. Clement could not grant Henry's request without antagonizing Charles, and antagonizing Charles in 1527 was not something that the Pope, who was effectively Charles's captive, could realistically do. The result was the specific impasse that produced the English Reformation, the most consequential, unintended consequence of a consanguinity dispensation dispute in European history. The nobility's strategic use of consanguinity as a basis for annulment was the other side of the consanguinity. Dispensation's role in the medieval marriage system. If the dispensation enabled the politically convenient marriage by overcoming the consanguinity obstacle, the consanguinity argument enabled the invalidation of the politically inconvenient marriage by retroactively identifying the obstacle that the dispensation had failed to properly address. The canonical rules about consanguinity were therefore a double-edged tool. They could be used to prevent marriages and to enable them, and the specific edge that was deployed at any given moment was the edge that served the political interest of the moment. The specific cases of medieval aristocratic marriages invalidated on consanguinity grounds after they had become politically inconvenient are among the more instructive episodes in the medieval intersection of canon law and political calculation. The marriage of King Philip II of France to Ingeborg of Denmark in 1193 was perhaps the most dramatically documented. Philip married Ingeborg, apparently was revolted by her for reasons that the historical record does not clearly explain, and the very next day after the ceremony began, the process of having the marriage declared invalid. The specific consanguinity argument that Philip's court presented was the argument that Philip and Ingeborg were related within the prohibited degrees through a genealogical connection that the detailed analysis could establish. The French bishops who considered the case in what the medieval commentators described as a suspiciously hasty process declared the marriage invalid on consanguinity grounds and permitted Philip to pursue the marriage to Agnes of Meran that he preferred. Pope Innocent III, who was not prepared to have the French Church unilaterally annul royal marriages on dubious consanguinity grounds without papal involvement, placed France under interdict for the treatment of Ingeborg and required Philip to take her back. The specific conflict between the French king's matrimonial preferences, the French bishops' canonical compliance with their king, and the papal authority over the canon law of marriage was played out over the subsequent years in the specific tortured negotiation that the interdict's lifting and the Ingeborg situation's eventual resolution required. Ingeborg remained technically Queen of France until Philip's death, though she was kept in confinement for most of the intervening period. The consanguinity argument had failed to produce the annulment that Philip wanted, but the attempt, and the specific bad faith with which it was pursued, was a demonstration of the specific way in which the canon law's consanguinity provisions were used as tools of political manipulation rather than as sincere expressions of canonical concern. Chapter 4. The Habsburgs, the most spectacular case of aristocratic consanguinity in European history. The Habsburgs were committed, not committed in the sense of determined or enthusiastic, though they were certainly both of those things. Committed in the sense of the family that had made a specific strategic decision. The motto that the later tradition attributed to them was, Bella gerant alii to Felix, Austria nube, others may wage war. You happy Austria marry, and was pursuing that decision with the specific single-minded efficiency of a dynasty that had identified marriage alliances as its primary tool for political expansion and was not going to let the canon law's consanguinity prohibition get in the way of the systematic application of that tool. The Habsburg family tree is one of the most extraordinary documents in the history of European genealogy, and its specific character, the loops and the convergences, the same ancestors appearing in multiple positions in the diagram, the specific marriages that connected cousins and second cousins and relatives of every degree, is the documentary evidence of the systematic inbreeding that the Habsburg marriage strategy produced over the course of approximately 2 centuries of deliberate matrimonial policy. The strategy was brilliant in its political conception and increasingly problematic in its biological consequences, and the arc of Habsburg history from the 15th century to the 17th is partly the arc of the dynasty that conquered Europe through marriage, and partly the arc of the dynasty that paid the biological price of the systematic cousin marriage that the conquest required. The foundation of the Habsburg strategy was laid by the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III and his son Maximilian I, who together assembled, through marriage, the specific combination of territories, the Netherlands, the Kingdom of Naples, the Kingdom of Spain, the Austrian territories, eventually the Americas, that made the Habsburg family the most geographically and politically dominant dynasty in European history. The specific marriages that produced these acquisitions were marriages that the dispensation system enabled, because the relevant partners were consistently within the prohibited degrees of consanguinity. Maximilian I married Mary of Burgundy, his son Philip married Juana of Castile, and Philip and Juana's children included the Emperor Charles V and Ferdinand I, who between them created the specific Habsburg dominance of 16th century Europe that made the dynasty's name synonymous with the concept of the universal monarchy that they briefly approached achieving. Charles V was the specific genealogical product of the Habsburg marriage strategy at its most accomplished. His grandparents were Maximilian I and Mary of Burgundy on his father's side, and Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile on his mother's side. Four of the most important rulers of the late 15th century, all converging in a single individual through the specific marriages that the Habsburg strategy had arranged. Charles was, at various points in his life, King of Spain, Holy Roman Emperor, King of Italy, Lord of the Netherlands, and ruler of territories in the Americas. The specific accumulation of the marriage alliances that his grandparents and parents had assembled. He was also the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, which is why the Henry VIII situation became the specific impasse it became. The marriage of Charles V to Isabella of Portugal, his first cousin, was the specific marriage that began the more intensive phase of the Habsburg inbreeding. The marriages within the dynasty itself, rather than marriages that brought new territories into the dynasty. Charles's son, Philip II of Spain, married his own first cousin, Maria of Portugal. Then the Queen of England, Mary I, his second cousin. Then Elizabeth of Valois. Then his own niece, Anna of Austria. Philip II marrying his niece, the daughter of his sister Maria, required a dispensation that the papacy granted with the specific acknowledgement that the relationship was within the prohibited degrees, but that the political necessity of the Spanish imperial alliance that the marriage would strengthen justified the canonical exception. The dispensation was granted. The marriage produced a son, the future Philip III of Spain. The acceleration of the inbreeding through the second half of the 16th century and into the 17th produced the specific biological consequences that the modern genetic analysis has confirmed, and that the contemporary observers of the late Habsburg rulers had already noticed in the observable physical and intellectual characteristics of the dynasty's final generations. The coefficient of inbreeding, the statistical measure of the genetic similarity between two related individuals, for Philip III of Spain has been calculated by the modern genetic historians at approximately 0.218, and for his son Philip IV of Spain at approximately 0.254. The coefficient for Carlos II, Charles II of Spain, the last Habsburg king of Spain, born 1661, who died without surviving children in 1700 and whose death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, has been calculated at approximately 0.254 as well, with some analyses putting it higher. To put this number in context, the coefficient for the offspring of a brother-sister union would be 0.25. Carlos II was approximately as genetically inbred as the child of a sibling marriage, the result not of a single sibling marriage, but of the accumulated effect of the systematic cousin marriages of the preceding 6 generations. Carlos II was, by all contemporary accounts and by the evidence of his portrait and the documentary record of his life, a man who bore the specific physical and intellectual marks of the accumulated Habsburg inbreeding. He was described as unable to chew properly because of the specific jaw malformation that the Habsburg prognathism, the famous protruding lower jaw that appears in the Habsburg portraits across multiple generations and that intensifies noticeably as the inbreeding increases, had reached in his generation. He had difficulty walking. He was described by contemporaries as mentally impaired, though the specific nature and severity of his intellectual difficulties is impossible to assess from the historical record with the precision that the modern medical framework would require. He was also the king of Spain, the ruler of the largest empire in the world, and the man whose death without an heir produced the most consequential succession crisis of the 18th century. The specific biological consequences of the Habsburg marriage strategy's most extreme phase had produced the specific political consequence of the extinction of the dynasty. And the extinction of the dynasty produced the War of the Spanish Succession, which reshaped the political map of Europe and established the conditions for the conflicts of the subsequent century. The Habsburg case is the extreme version of a pattern that was widespread across the medieval and early modern European nobility, and its extremity makes visible the biological consequences of the systematic consanguinity that the more moderate version of the same pattern was also producing at lower intensity in other dynasties. The cousin marriage that was the normal tool of the medieval aristocratic alliance strategy was producing, in the families that pursued it most consistently and most systematically, the accumulated genetic consequences that the modern understanding of inbreeding depression predicts. Chapter 5. The genetics. What actually happens when relatives have children. Let's talk about the biology, not in the alarmist, sensationalist way, not the tabloid version of the genetics of inbreeding, with its emphasis on the most dramatic possible outcomes. The actual biology, which is interesting and which explains specifically why the canon law's consanguinity prohibition was, in its biological function, if not in its canonical intention, aimed at a real problem. The fundamental mechanism of inbreeding depression, the term that the geneticists use for the reduction in biological fitness that occurs in the offspring of related individuals, is the mechanism of recessive alleles. Every person carries 2 copies of every gene, one from each parent. For many genes, one version of the gene, the dominant allele, is expressed in the person's characteristics, while the other version, the recessive allele, is not expressed because the dominant version is present. Recessive alleles are only expressed, only show their effects in the person's characteristics, when the person carries 2 copies of the recessive allele, one from each parent. Many of the genetic variants that cause disease or reduced fitness are recessive alleles. They are harmful, but they don't cause harm in the person who carries 1 copy because the dominant allele from the other parent is functioning correctly. The person who carries 1 copy of the harmful recessive allele is a carrier. They are not affected by the allele, but they can pass it to their children. When unrelated people have children, the probability that both parents carry the same specific recessive allele is low. The harmful allele is relatively rare in the population, and the probability that any random person has picked up the same specific rare allele is correspondingly small. The children of unrelated parents are therefore unlikely to inherit 2 copies of the same harmful recessive allele. When closely related people have children, the calculation changes. If 2 people share a common ancestor who carried a specific harmful recessive allele, both of them may have inherited it. They carry the allele because they are both descended from the person who originally had it. When these 2 related carriers have children together, the probability that their children inherit 2 copies of the harmful allele, one from each parent, is significantly higher than it would be for the children of unrelated individuals. The specific probability depends on the degree of relatedness. For first cousins, the people who share 1 pair of grandparents, the probability that they share the same harmful recessive allele is significantly higher than for unrelated individuals. For double first cousins, the specific relationship created when 2 siblings from one family marry 2 siblings from another the probability is higher still. For the uncle-niece or aunt-nephew relationship, the specific relationship that Philip II of Spain had with his wife Anna, the probability is higher than for first cousins. The accumulation of these probabilities over multiple generations of cousin marriages, the specific Habsburg pattern, produces the dramatic increase in the coefficient of inbreeding that the Carlos II analysis confirmed. And the biological consequences that the coefficient predicts are the biological consequences that the contemporary accounts of Carlos II described. The medieval church's prohibition on marriages within the prohibited degrees was therefore, regardless of its canonical and theological justification, aimed at a real biological problem. The genetic consequences of the close cousin marriage that the modern genetics has analyzed in terms that were not available to the medieval canon lawyers, but whose effects they were attempting to address through the institutional mechanism of the consanguinity prohibition. This is not to say that the Church's consanguinity rules were designed as a genetic health policy. They weren't, because the concept of genetics didn't exist. The canonical justification for the consanguinity prohibition was theological and social. The spiritual kinship that the Church doctrine attached to the blood relationship, the social disruption of the incest taboos violation, the specific concern about the power dynamics of marriage within close family groups, the genetic consequences of inbreeding were not part of the medieval theological discussion, but the biological reality that the genetic analysis confirms is the reality that the empirical observation of the medieval world was registering in the specific way that the empirical observation of patterns over many generations produces the behavioral rules that the genetic analysis can subsequently explain. The recognition that cousin marriages produced specific problems, physical, intellectual, reproductive, was present in the medieval medical tradition's discussion of the consanguinity prohibition as a health matter, even if the specific mechanism was not understood. The medieval medical tradition's discussion of consanguinity was organized around the humoral theory that was the medieval medical framework, and it produced the specific argument that the blood relationship between two people meant that their humors were too similar, and that the children of such a union would lack the diversity of humoral constitution that the healthy child required. This is wrong in its mechanism. The humoral theory is not an accurate description of the body's functioning, but it is correct in its general direction. The children of closely related parents are indeed less diverse in their genetic constitution than the children of unrelated parents, and the reduction in diversity has the biological consequences that the inbreeding depression literature documents. The specific medical observations that the medieval tradition recorded about the children of related unions, the increased rates of what the medieval medical vocabulary described as constitutional weakness, of the specific physical characteristics that the modern genetics recognizes as expressions of recessive alleles, of the reduced reproductive fitness that the severely inbred individual typically showed, were the empirical observations that the experience of the inbreeding communities had produced, filtered through the inadequate theoretical framework of the humoral medicine into the specifically wrong but directionally correct conclusions of the medieval medical discussion of consanguinity. Chapter 6, The Byzantine Case. How the Eastern Roman Empire did consanguinity completely differently. Constantinople had different opinions. The specific difference between the Western Latin Church's approach to consanguinity and the Eastern Orthodox Church's approach to consanguinity is the difference at the division of the Roman Empire and the subsequent divergence of the two Christian traditions produced in one of the most practically important areas of canon law. And the difference is substantial enough and interesting enough to require its own chapter rather than a footnote to the Western narrative. The Eastern Church, the Orthodox tradition, centered on Constantinople, whose canonical authority over the Christian communities of the Byzantine Empire, the Balkans, and, eventually, Russia was the specific institutional counterpart to the Roman papacy's authority over the Western Church, developed its own consanguinity rules from the same biblical foundations, but through a different legal and theological tradition. And the results were different in ways that had practical consequences for the marriage practices of the Byzantine world. The Byzantine approach was, in certain respects, more restrictive than the Western approach, and in other respects, less restrictive. And the specific combination of the greater restriction and the lesser restriction reflects the different legal tradition that the Byzantine canon law was drawing on. The Eastern Church maintained the Roman counting system for degrees of consanguinity rather than adopting the Germanic system that the Western Church had used to extend the prohibition to the seventh degree. And this difference in counting method meant that the Byzantine prohibition extended to a different range of relationships. The Byzantine prohibition on marriage extended to the sixth degree under the Roman counting system, which, when translated into the practical relationships it covered, prohibited marriage between people as distantly related as sixth cousins. But because the Roman system counted differently from the Germanic system, the sixth degree under the Roman counting covered a different genealogical territory than the sixth degree under the Germanic counting, and the specific relationships prohibited and permitted were therefore different between the two traditions. The practical consequence of this difference was that the Byzantine noble was operating under a different set of marriage constraints from the Western European noble, and the specific genealogical calculations that the Byzantine marriage market required were therefore different calculations. The Byzantine dispensation system existed. The Patriarch of Constantinople and the Emperor could both grant exemptions from the consanguinity prohibition in appropriate cases, but its operation was different from the papal dispensation system of the West. The emperor's role in Byzantine marriage regulation was the specific feature that distinguished the Byzantine system most clearly from the Western system. The Byzantine emperor was not the secular ruler whose marriage practices were subject to the ecclesiastical authority in the way that the Western king's marriages were subject to papal oversight. The Byzantine emperor was the specific theologically loaded figure of the sacred ruler, whose relationship with the church was the relationship of the supreme earthly authority with the religious institution that legitimized that authority, not the adversarial relationship that the papacy and the medieval Western kings regularly found themselves in, but the theoretically harmonious, practically complicated relationship of the two powers that the Byzantine political theology tried to keep in balance. The emperor's marriages were therefore regulated by a combination of the canonical rules and the imperial prerogative that gave the Byzantine ruler more flexibility in practice than the Western king typically had, though the specific flexibility was contested, and the specific cases where the emperor's matrimonial preferences conflicted with the church's canonical rules produced the specific conflicts that the Byzantine historical record documents. The case of the Emperor Nikephoros I Phocas, who in 963 married Theophano, the widow of his predecessor, the Emperor Romanos II, was the specific early Byzantine case that illustrated the specific complexity of the widow marriage in the Byzantine canonical tradition. The marriage was contested on the grounds of Theophanos' specific ritual impurity as the widow of the previous emperor, and the Patriarch Polyeuktos' refusal to crown Theophano as empress was the specific ecclesiastical pushback against the imperial marriage preference that the Byzantine system occasionally produced. But the consanguinity aspect of the Byzantine marriage regulation produced its most distinctive cases in the specific tradition of the Byzantine dynastic marriages that the imperial system required. The Byzantine dynastic marriage market was even more restricted than the Western aristocratic marriage market, because the specific pool of candidates appropriate for imperial marriage was defined by the Byzantine court's specific social hierarchy. The porphyrogenetos, the born in the purple, the children born to the reigning emperor in the purple chamber of the imperial palace, who had the specific imperial status that the dynastic logic preferred for the marriages of the imperial family. The specific smallness of the pool of appropriate candidates meant that the Byzantine imperial family's marriages had a specific tendency toward the consanguinity that the restricted pool produced. In the Byzantine dispensation, tradition developed the specific flexibility in the consanguinity rules that the imperial family's marriage needs required. The Emperor Leo VI, the Wise, who ruled from 886 to 912, is the Byzantine case that most directly illustrates the tension between the canonical rules and the imperial marriage necessity. Leo VI had 3 wives in succession, each of whom died without producing a surviving male heir. The Byzantine canonical tradition, which the Eastern Church maintained with greater rigor than the Western Church on the specific question of multiple marriages, considered the 3rd marriage barely acceptable and the 4th marriage scandalous. When Leo's 3rd wife also died without producing the male heir, Leo contracted a 4th marriage to Zoe Carbonopsina, who subsequently produced the son that the previous 3 marriages had not. And the specific canonical crisis of the emperor's 4th marriage produced one of the most acrimonious disputes between the Byzantine imperial authority and the patriarchate of the medieval period. The patriarch Nicholas Mystikos refused to allow Leo to enter the Hagia Sophia for the Christmas liturgy in 906, in the specific public humiliation of the emperor that the canonical dispute produced. The subsequent negotiation, the specific Byzantine combination of the political pressure, the ecclesiastical maneuvering, and the eventual compromise that the Byzantine system developed for the resolution of the church-state conflicts, produced the Tome of Union of 920, which resolved the specific crisis of Leo's 4th marriage by acknowledging its canonical irregularity while permitting its children to be considered legitimate. The Byzantine approach to consanguinity was not merely the Western approach with different numbers. It was a different system, developed from a different legal tradition, operating within a different relationship between the ecclesiastical and the imperial authority, and producing different specific outcomes in the cases where the canonical rules and the political necessities of the Byzantine world came into conflict. Chapter 7. The Papal Dispensation Business. The Economics and Politics of Permission. The dispensation was not free. The specific economic reality of the papal dispensation system, the specific fee that the petitioner for the consanguinity dispensation paid to the papal curia in exchange for the permission to marry the prohibited relative, was the economic reality of the medieval church's administrative operation, and it was also the specific economic reality that the church's critics, from the medieval satirists to the Protestant reformers, identified as one of the more blatant examples of the church's transformation of the spiritual function into the financial transaction. The criticism was not entirely unfair. The dispensation fee was not a small administrative charge covering the cost of processing the petition. It was substantial payment calibrated to the financial capacity of the petitioner, which meant that the dispensation was most readily available to those who could most afford it, and least available to those who could least afford it. The wealthy noble who needed the consanguinity dispensation paid the fee and received the dispensation. The poor peasant who needed the consanguinity dispensation confronted a fee that was genuinely prohibitive relative to their resources, and the specific inequality of access to the canonical permission was the specific inequality that the graduated fee structure produced. The papal curia, the administrative bureaucracy of the medieval papacy, centered on Rome and comprising the specific offices and the specific officials that the management of the Church's universal jurisdiction required, was the institution that processed the dispensation petitions and collected the dispensation fees. The penitentiary was the specific curial office that handled the consanguinity dispensation in its most sensitive forms, the cases where the consanguinity was discovered after the marriage, where the relationship was unusually close, where the specific canonical complexity required the personal judgment of the cardinal penitentiary, rather than the routine processing of the ordinary petition. The chancery was the office that handled the more routine dispensations. The third and fourth degree consanguinity cases that the post-1215 canon law had made the standard range of the nobility's marriage dispensation needs. The chancery's processing of the dispensation petition was the administrative process of the medieval bureaucracy at its most developed. The petition examined, the fee assessed, the document prepared, the seal applied, the document delivered to the petitioner who could now proceed with the prohibited marriage on canonical authority. The specific fee schedule of the papal dispensation system was the fee schedule of the institution that had developed, over the course of the medieval period, a sophisticated understanding of the market for its specific services and a calibrated pricing structure that extracted the maximum available revenue from the petitioners who needed those services. The fee for the dispensation to marry a first cousin was one amount. The fee for the dispensation to marry a more closely related person was a higher amount. The fee for the retrospective dispensation, the dispensation granted after the marriage had already been celebrated, was higher still, incorporating the specific premium for the urgency and the canonical delicacy of the situation. The English evidence for the dispensation fee system is particularly well documented, because the English royal administration's records of the payments made to Rome for various canonical services are among the more complete records of the medieval papal English financial relationship. The specific payments recorded for consanguinity dispensations, from the large payments of the royal family for the politically significant dispensations to the smaller payments of the gentry for the more routine cases, provide the specific picture of the dispensation system as the revenue-generating operation that it was. The traffic in dispensations was one of the specific targets of the reforming criticism of the medieval church, and the criticism intensified in the 15th and 16th centuries as the reformers developed the specific case that the papacy had transformed the spiritual function of the sacramental system into the commercial operation of the bureaucratic church. Martin Luther's attack on the sale of indulgences, which he launched in 1517 with the 95 Theses, and which triggered the Reformation, was the most famous version of this critique. But the dispensation traffic was a parallel target of the same critique, the specific commercialization of the canonical permission that the Reform tradition identified as the corruption of the institution. The political dimension of the dispensation system was the dimension that the purely economic analysis misses. The dispensation was not merely a revenue transaction. It was a political tool, and the granting or the withholding of the dispensation was a specific exercise of the political leverage that the control of the canonical permission gave the papacy over the marriage alliances of the European nobility. The dispensation for the politically convenient marriage was the papacy's specific gift to the petitioner. The specific favor that the petitioner owed the papacy, that created the specific relationship of obligation that the medieval political culture recognized as binding. The withholding of the dispensation for the politically inconvenient marriage was the papacy's specific sanction against the petitioner, the specific penalty that the papal authority could impose through the canonical mechanism without the more dramatic tools of the interdict or the excommunication. The specific cases where the papal dispensation was used as a diplomatic instrument, where the granting or withholding of the permission was the specific tool of the papal foreign policy, are among the more instructive examples of the medieval church's operation as a political actor alongside its operation as a religious institution. The papacy that granted the dispensation for the marriage that would cement the anti-French alliance was the papacy doing diplomacy with canonical tools. The papacy that withheld the dispensation for the marriage that would strengthen the emperor at the church's expense was the papacy protecting its institutional interests through the canonical mechanism. The reformers who attacked the dispensation system were not wrong that it had been corrupted from its canonical purpose, the protection of the church's rules about appropriate marriage, into a revenue source and a political tool. But the corruption was not a sudden development or a simple story of institutional greed. It was the specific, gradual, incremental process of an institution that had genuine canonical authority over the marriage practices of an entire civilization, and that had discovered, over the course of centuries, the specific ways in which that authority could be converted into the financial and political resources that the institution required to function. Chapter 8. The famous cases. The most spectacular consanguinity. Scandals of the medieval period. The cases were extraordinary, not extraordinary in the sense of rare. The medieval period produced a continuous supply of consanguinity complications, from the routine dispensation requests of the minor nobility to the spectacular canonical crises of the greatest dynasties. Extraordinary in the sense of the specific combination of the high stakes, the interesting personalities, the canonical complexity, and the historical consequences that made certain cases rise above the routine management of the consanguinity rules into the events that the historical record preserves as the particularly illuminating examples of the medieval consanguinity system under pressure. The marriage of Louis VII of France to Eleanor of Aquitaine, and its annulment in 1152, is the case that most clearly illustrates the specific use of the consanguinity argument as the tool of the marriage that needed to be ended for political and personal reasons, rather than the marriage that needed to be prevented for canonical ones. Louis and Eleanor had been married since 1137. They had 2 daughters. Eleanor had accompanied Louis on the Second Crusade in 1147 to 1149, and the specific events of that crusade, the rumors about Eleanor's behavior in Antioch, the specific deterioration of the marriage relationship that the crusade documented, had produced a marriage that both parties found intolerable, and that Louis, particularly, found intolerable. The consanguinity argument was the canonical tool available for ending the marriage. Louis and Eleanor were related. They were in the 7th degree of consanguinity under the pre-1215 canon law, which meant they were at the very edge of the prohibited zone. And the specific argument that the canon law provided for the invalidity of a marriage contracted within the prohibited degrees without proper dispensation was the argument that Louis's advisors presented to the Council of Beaugency in 1152. The council annulled the marriage. Eleanor was free, and within 2 months of the annulment, Eleanor married Henry of Anjou, who became Henry II of England in 1154. In a marriage that was itself within the prohibited degrees. Eleanor and Henry were related in the 3rd degree of consanguinity, significantly closer than the 7th degree that had been the basis for the Louis annulment. The specific speed of the Eleanor-Henry marriage and the specific closeness of its consanguinity relative to the Louis marriages. Consanguinity was the specific evidence that the consanguinity argument in the Louis case had been the tool of the desired annulment rather than the expression of canonical concern. The historical consequences of the Eleanor of Aquitaine annulment were the historical consequences of the marriage that Eleanor's freedom enabled. The specific, dramatic, long-running conflict between the Plantagenet kings of England and the French crown that the transfer of Eleanor's vast Aquitaine territories from the French king's wife to the English king's wife produced. The consanguinity dispensation, or rather the absence of the dispensation challenge to the Eleanor-Henry marriage, was the specific canonical negligence that the political situation explained and that the papacy chose not to address. The case of Frederick II, Holy Roman Emperor, who was simultaneously the most powerful ruler in the Western world and the most spectacular violator of the canonical rules in the 13th century, provides the consanguinity angle of the most complicated canonical situation of the medieval period. Frederick II married 3 times, required dispensations for the consanguinity complications of at least 2 of those marriages, was excommunicated 4 times by 2 different popes, conducted a crusade while excommunicated, and generally treated the canon law's requirements as obstacles to be negotiated around rather than rules to be obeyed. His second marriage, to Yolande of Jerusalem in 1225, was the marriage that gave him the claim to the Kingdom of Jerusalem that he subsequently pursued through the specific, unprecedented diplomatic negotiation with the Sultan of Egypt that produced the treaty that returned Jerusalem to Christian control in 1229, while Frederick was excommunicated and therefore canonically prohibited from undertaking the crusade he was conducting. The consanguinity of the Ibaim Frederick-Yolande marriage required the dispensation that the papacy was not particularly eager to grant to the emperor, who was in the process of being excommunicated, and the specific canonical complications of Frederick's matrimonial situation were one thread in the much larger canonical crisis of the Frederick papacy relationship. The marriage of Philip IV of France, Philip the Fair, to Joan of Navarre in 1284 produced the specific dynastic situation that the consanguinity rules subsequently complicated through the question of the succession to the French throne. Philip and Joan's children included 3 sons who each successively became King of France without producing male heirs. A specific biological failure of the French royal succession that the consanguinity of their parentage may have contributed to. And a daughter, Isabella, who married Edward II of England and produced Edward III, whose claim to the French throne through his mother was the specific claim that the 100 Years' War was fought over. The 100 Years' War, the defining conflict of the 14th and 15th century European history, consuming the energies and the populations of England and France for approximately a century of intermittent but devastating warfare, had at its canonical root the specific question of whether the female line of succession could transmit the claim to the French throne, which was the question that Edward III's claim through Isabella required answering. the specific answer that the French gave, the Salic law interpretation that prohibited the transmission of the throne through the female line, was the answer that denied Edward's claim, and that the English considered the specific injustice that the war was fought to remedy. The consanguinity was not the direct cause of the 100 Years' War. The causes were multiple, the political and economic and dynastic factors too numerous to reduce to any single thread. But the specific biological failure of the Capetian direct male line, the 3 sons of Philip IV who failed to produce surviving male heirs, was one of the necessary conditions for the succession crisis that the war was about, and the consanguinity of Philip IV's ancestry was one of the factors that the modern genetic analysis identifies as contributing to the reproductive difficulties of his sons. The case of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, the specific long-running relationship between John, the Duke of Lancaster and the 3rd son of Edward III of England, and Catherine Swynford, his children's governess and eventual wife, is the consanguinity case that illuminates the specific intersection of the consanguinity rules with the legitimization of children born outside of marriage. John and Catherine conducted a relationship for approximately 20 years before marrying in 1396, producing 4 children, the Beauforts, who were born outside of marriage and whose status required the specific legal and canonical regularization that the subsequent legitimization provided. The legitimization of the Beaufort children, confirmed by papal bull and by act of parliament, regularized their status in the specific way that the medieval law provided for the children of the subsequent marriage of their parents. But the subsequent qualification that Henry IV added to the parliamentary legitimization, the specific limitation that excluded the Beauforts from the succession to the throne, was the specific political insertion into the canonical regularization that the subsequent history of the Beauforts made consequential. Because the Beaufort line produced, through John Beaufort's granddaughter, Margaret Beaufort, the claim to the English throne that her son Henry Tudor asserted at Bosworth Field in 1485, the specific tortured legitimacy of the Beaufort descent, legitimate but explicitly excluded from the succession by Henry IV's qualification, a qualification whose legal validity was itself disputed, was the specific dynastic complexity that Henry VII's claim to the throne required navigating. The consanguinity of the Lancastrian Beaufort line, the canonical regularization of John of Gaunt's children, and the political qualification that Henry IV had inserted into the regularization were the specific canonical threads that ran from the bedroom of John of Gaunt to the battlefield of Bosworth Field. Chapter 9. The Peasant Reality. What the village consanguinity situation actually looked like in the records. The records are specific. The specific quality of the medieval record that survives from the ordinary village, the manor court rolls, the church court records, the episcopal registers, the occasional detailed survey that the medieval administration produced, is the quality of the record that was not kept for the purpose of the historical inquiry. It was kept for the purpose of the administration, the management of, the manner, the enforcement of the canon law, the recording of the episcopal visitation, and its survival into the modern archive is the survival of the administrative record that was not deliberately preserved, but that was not deliberately destroyed either. The church court records are the specific documentary source for the ordinary person's encounter with the consanguinity rules and the cases that the church courts heard. The consanguinity challenges to intended marriages, the post hoc discoveries of consanguinity in existing marriages, the petitions for the retrospective regularization of marriages contracted in ignorance of the prohibited degree, are the specific window into the way the consanguinity rules operated at the level of the ordinary person rather than the nobility. The Diocese of Ely's medieval court records, one of the better preserved sets of English ecclesiastical records from the medieval period, contain the specific ordinary cases of the consanguinity law in operation. The case of Thomas and Agnes, whose intended marriage was challenged in the court on the grounds that they were related in the fourth degree of consanguinity through a common great-great-grandparent. The case of William and Joan, already married and the parents of 2 children, whose marriage was found to be within the prohibited degrees by the visiting archdeacon and who required the retrospective dispensation that the bishop eventually granted. The case of Robert and Margaret, who petitioned for the dispensation before the marriage, on the grounds of the third-degree consanguinity that their respective families' genealogies made visible. These cases are not dramatic. They do not involve kings and popes and the fate of dynasties. They involve the specific, ordinary people of the specific, ordinary village, whose management of the consanguinity rules was the management of the canon law as it applied to the most important social transaction of the ordinary person's life, the choice of spouse. The specific pattern that the church court records reveal is the pattern that the demographic analysis of the village genealogies predicts. The consanguinity was common. The discovery of the consanguinity was selective, and the management of the discovered consanguinity was negotiated. The cases that reached the church court were the cases where the consanguinity was contested, where someone had a reason to raise the challenge rather than looking the other way. And the resolution of those cases was the negotiated outcome of the canonical process applied to the specific social situation. The retrospective dispensation cases are the most humanly interesting cases in the church court records because they are the cases where the canonical process was dealing with the human reality of the existing marriage and the existing family rather than the anticipated marriage that had not yet happened. The discovery of the consanguinity after the marriage, whether by the visiting archdeacon who examined the parish records more carefully than the original officiating priest had, or by the hostile neighbor who chose this moment to raise the challenge they had been sitting on, or by the couple themselves who had come to know their respective family histories more thoroughly in the years of the marriage, created the specific canonical crisis of the marriage that was technically invalid, but that the human situation made very difficult to invalidate. The Bishop of Worcester's register for the early 14th century contains a series of retrospective dispensation cases that illustrate the specific human complexity of the situation with unusual clarity. One of the most detailed cases involves a couple who had been married for 14 years, had produced 7 children, and were described in the petition as living in genuine affection and mutual support, and who had discovered through the genealogical inquiry that a property dispute had required that they were in the third degree of consanguinity through a great-grandparent who had not been mentioned in the original band's inquiry. The petition for retrospective dispensation noted the 14 years of marriage, the 7 children, the absence of any canonical harm to anyone beyond the technical invalidity of the union, and the specific hardship that the invalidation of the marriage would impose on the children whose legitimacy the invalidity would compromise. The bishop granted the dispensation. The specific pastoral judgment that the bishop applied, the weighing of the canonical violation against the human reality of the situation, the recognition that the canon law's purpose was the service of the human community rather than the punishment of the technical violation. was the specific judgment that the church court records show bishops making repeatedly in the retrospective consanguinity cases. The canon law required the dispensation. The human situation required the dispensation to be granted rather than refused. The system, in its better moments, was flexible enough to accommodate both. The village's specific management of the consanguinity rules was the village's specific management of all the rules that the external authority, the lord, the bishop, the king, imposed on the community's internal life. The rules were real, the authority was real, and the sanctions were real, but the enforcement was selective. The local knowledge of the genealogies was imperfect. The priest's capacity to investigate every couple's ancestry thoroughly was limited, and the community's preference for managing its own social arrangements without the intervention of the external authorities' canonical machinery was the preference of the community that understood its own situation better than the external authority did. The consanguinity rules shaped the medieval marriage market in specific documentable ways: the preference for the spouse from outside the immediate village, the strategic value of the marriage into the family from the neighboring community, whose genealogical distance from one's own family was greater than the genealogical distance of the neighbor who had been in the same village for 5 generations. The specific marriage patterns of the medieval English village show the specific preference for the spouse from the village, whose genealogy was less entangled with one's own. Not the dramatic statement of the anti-incest taboos operation, but the practical, ordinary preference of the family that understood the consanguinity rules well enough to navigate around them in the simplest available way. Chapter 10. The Annulment Machine. How consanguinity became the medieval divorce. The marriage could not be ended. This was the specific theological position of the medieval church on the question of the dissolved marriage, the doctrine of the indissolubility of the valid sacramental marriage that the canon law developed and maintained with the specific rigor of the institution that had made the marriage's permanence one of its central theological commitments. The valid marriage, properly contracted, properly celebrated, consummated, this marriage could not be ended, not by the king's preference, not by the noble's political recalculation, not by the simple human reality that the two people involved had stopped being able to tolerate each other. It could not be ended, but it could be found to have never validly existed. This distinction, the distinction between ending a valid marriage and discovering that the marriage had never been valid in the first place, was the specific canonical gap through which the medieval annulment tradition drove its coach and horses. The annulment was not the divorce. The divorce ended the valid marriage. The annulment declared that the marriage had never been valid, that the specific impediment which the investigation had uncovered had prevented the valid marriage from being contracted in the first place, leaving the parties not as divorced spouses, but as two people who had participated in a ceremony that had produced no binding sacramental effect. The consanguinity impediment was the annulment's most frequently used tool, and the specific reason for its frequency was a specific combination of qualities that made it ideally suited to the purpose. The consanguinity impediment was canonical, rooted in the genuine, serious, theologically grounded canon law prohibition. It was retrospectively discoverable. The genealogical investigation that revealed the prohibited relationship could always be conducted after the marriage as well as before it. It was adjustable. The range of the prohibited degrees was wide enough that the investigation that was sufficiently motivated could generally find something in the family trees of two medieval noble families that fell within the prohibited range, and it was deniable. The parties could claim ignorance of the consanguinity at the time of the marriage, which removed the bad faith from the situation and made the annulment the correction of an honest mistake rather than the deliberate evasion of the canonical rule. The combination of these qualities made the consanguinity annulment the specific tool of the medieval marriage that needed to end. Not the honest tool of the canonical system working as intended, but the strategic tool of the political and personal calculation dressed in the canonical clothing that the system required. The investigation of the consanguinity was the specific process that the motivated party initiated to produce the evidence of the impediment. The genealogical research, the examination of the family trees, the identification of the common ancestor, the calculation of the degree of relationship was conducted by the canonical lawyers, whose professional skill in the specific art of finding the consanguinity that the client needed found was the specific professional service that the medieval legal market provided. The canonical lawyer who could trace the client's family tree back 7 generations and find the common ancestor with the spouse's family tree was the specific professional equivalent of the modern divorce lawyer. The person whose skill in the relevant system's specific requirements was the tool that converted the client's desire for the outcome into the canonical evidence that the system required to produce that outcome. The specific bad faith of the process was the specific bad faith that the medieval canonical commentators themselves identified and criticized. The summist Huguccio, one of the most important canon lawyers of the 12th century, wrote with specific clarity about the manipulation of the consanguinity rules as a mechanism for the dissolution of inconvenient marriages, identifying the practice as the specific abuse of the canonical system that it was, and arguing that the Church needed to develop the procedural protections that would prevent the consanguinity investigation from becoming the tool of the motivated party, rather than the genuine correction of the canonical violation. The procedural protections that the canon law subsequently developed, the requirements for the corroborating witnesses, the genealogical documentation, the specific standards of proof that the consanguinity claim required were the Church's specific response to the abuse that Huguccio and others had identified. The protections made the consanguinity annulment harder to obtain fraudulently, but they did not make it impossible. And the motivated party with the resources to fund the investigation and the legal representation to navigate the canonical process could generally find the path through the procedural requirements to the annulment that they sought. The specific frequency of the consanguinity annulment among the medieval nobility and the specific pattern in which the consanguinity was discovered after the marriage had become politically or personally inconvenient rather than before the marriage was contracted is the documentary evidence of the system's manipulation. The marriages whose consanguinity was discovered before the ceremony were the marriages whose parties genuinely didn't know about the relationship. The marriages whose consanguinity was discovered after 10 years and 2 children, and the emergence of a more desirable political alliance, were the marriages whose consanguinity had been known or discoverable all along. The specific irony of the consanguinity annulment machine was the irony that the same rules that were supposed to prevent the consanguinity of the marriage were being used to end marriages that the rules had permitted through dispensation. The dispensation enabled the marriage. The subsequent investigation challenged the dispensation's validity. The challenge to the dispensation's validity produced the annulment of the marriage that the dispensation had enabled. The consanguinity that the dispensation had addressed was rehabilitated as the grounds for the marriage's invalidity by the party, who now found the marriage inconvenient. This was not a theoretical possibility. It was the specific practice of the Henry VIII case. The challenge to the validity of the dispensation that Julius II had granted for the Catherine of Aragon marriage was the challenge to the canonical foundation of the marriage itself, using the consanguinity that the dispensation had addressed as the grounds for the marriage's invalidity on the theory that the dispensation had been improperly granted. The consanguinity that the dispensation had permitted became, when the political need arose, the consanguinity that the annulment required. Chapter 11. The Children. What happened to the offspring of the canonically complicated marriage? The children were not automatically illegitimate. This is the specific, important clarification that the history of the consanguinity annulment requires, because the modern instinct, shaped by the modern understanding of divorce and the modern legal system's approach to the status of children, is to assume that the annulment of the parents' marriage automatically rendered the children of that marriage illegitimate and therefore deprived of the specific legal and social status that legitimacy conferred. The canon law's approach was more nuanced than this instinct suggests, and the specific nuance was the doctrine of the putative marriage. The marriage that was not valid in canonical terms, but that had been contracted in good faith by at least one of the parties, and that the canon law treated as sufficient to confer the status of legitimate children on the offspring of the union. The putative marriage doctrine was the specific canonical development that addressed the specific human problem of the innocent child whose status would otherwise be determined by the canonical fault of the parents, if the consanguinity had been known to both parties at the time of the marriage, if the prohibited degree had been contracted with full knowledge of the impediment, in deliberate defiance of the canonical prohibition. Then the children of the union were canonically illegitimate, if the consanguinity had been unknown to at least one of the parties. If the marriage had been contracted in good faith with the genuine belief that no impediment existed, then the children were legitimate, despite the subsequent annulment of the marriage on grounds of the consanguinity. The practical consequence of the putative marriage doctrine was that the consanguinity annulment did not, in most cases, render the children illegitimate, because the party seeking the annulment invariably claimed that the consanguinity had not been known at the time of the marriage. The claim of ignorance was the specific canonical formula that preserved both the annulment and the children's legitimacy simultaneously. The assertion that the marriage had been contracted in good faith, without knowledge of the impediment, that justified the annulment because the impediment was real, while preserving the children's status because the good faith was genuine or at least claimed. The children of the annulled marriage were therefore, in most cases, canonically legitimate despite the annulment, but the canonical legitimacy and the social and political legitimacy were different things, and the specific children of the specific annulments that the political circumstances produced were the children whose status was contested in the specific ways that the political calculation of their parents' enemies required. The children of Philip II of France and Ingeborg of Denmark, had there been any, which the brevity of the effective marriage prevented, would have been the specific test case for the putative marriage doctrine in one of its most politically consequential applications. The children of John of Gaunt and his various unions were the specific cases where the legitimate versus illegitimate distinction was the distinction that the political situation required managing carefully, and the Beaufort legitimization was the specific canonical and parliamentary operation that addressed the situation of the children whose status the circumstances of their birth had complicated. The most consequential application of the children's status question in the English context was the status of Mary and Elizabeth Tudor, the daughters of Henry VIII by Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn respectively, whose legitimacy was determined not by the canonical doctrine of the putative marriage, but by the specific acts of Parliament that Henry used to manipulate their status in response to the political needs of the moment. Mary was legitimate, then illegitimate, then legitimate. Again. Elizabeth was legitimate, then illegitimate, then legitimate again. The specific parliamentary mechanism that Henry used to manage their status was the specific tool of the secular law applied to the question that the canon law had previously owned, the English Reformation's transfer of jurisdiction from the canonical to the parliamentary, producing the specific situation where the children's legitimacy was a matter of legislation rather than theology. The children of the consanguineous marriages that the dispensation had enabled were children whose legitimacy was not in question as long as the dispensation was valid. When the dispensation's validity was challenged, when the annulment argument was constructed on the challenge to the dispensation, the children's legitimacy became the specific collateral damage of the annulment process, requiring the putative marriage doctrine's protection if the children's status was to be preserved despite the marriage's invalidity. The specific human cost of the consanguinity annulment machine was therefore not primarily the cost to the parties whose marriage was annulled, both of whom were generally free to remarry, and whose political and social situation was not fundamentally altered by the annulment. The specific human cost was the cost to the children, whose status was determined by the canonical and political calculation of the adults, and whose legitimacy was the specific thing at stake in the annulment process, to be preserved or sacrificed according to the specific needs of the situation. Chapter 12. The theologians. What the church actually thought it was doing. The theologians had reasons, not merely the political reasons, and the financial reasons, and the reasons of institutional leverage, and the reasons of the canonical authority that needed to justify its extension into the specific territory of the marriage market. Though all of these were present, operating behind the specific theological arguments that the canon law deployed, the theologians had genuine theological reasons rooted in the specific doctrinal framework of the medieval church's understanding of the human person, the family, and the social order that the marriage institution was supposed to serve. The incest prohibition was the starting point. The specific biblical and natural law foundation that prohibited the sexual union of persons in the closest degrees of blood relationship, grounded in the genuine human recognition of the sexual taboo that virtually every human culture has developed independently for the closest family relationships, the parent-child union, then the sibling union. These prohibitions were not the church's invention. They were the human community's specific cross-cultural recognition that the sexual organization of the family required the specific prohibition of the closest relationships, both for the biological reasons that the modern genetics confirms and for the social reasons that the anthropological tradition has analyzed. The extension of the prohibition beyond the closest relationships was where the theological reasoning became more specifically the Church's contribution rather than the universal human consensus. The canon lawyers argued that the prohibition of the cousin marriage was required by the same logic that required the prohibition of the sibling marriage, the specific extension of the family solidarity logic that made the sibling relationship the paradigm of the non-sexual kinship, and that extended that paradigm outward through the degrees of relationship in the diminishing form that the distance of the relationship produced. Thomas Aquinas, the most systematic of the medieval theologians, whose engagement with the consanguinity prohibition was the engagement of the philosopher who wanted to understand the foundation of the rule rather than merely apply it, argued that the consanguinity prohibition served two specific purposes that the natural law supported. First, the extension of the marriage prohibition to the cousins, and beyond forced the family to form alliances with other families, rather than remaining endogamous, producing the specific social benefit of the network of alliances that the exogamous marriage created. Second, the familial affection that the close blood relationship naturally produced was the wrong foundation for the specific, romantic, exclusive affection that the marriage relationship required. The cousin was too much loved as a cousin to be properly loved as a spouse, and the confusion of the two types of love was the specific harm that the prohibition was designed to prevent. The Thomistic argument for the consanguinity prohibition was the argument from the social benefit of the exogamous marriage and the psychological logic of the appropriate affect. And both of these are arguments that the modern social science can partially validate. The first through the anthropological analysis of the social functions of the exogamous marriage alliance, and the second through the psychological research on the specific suppression of sexual interest that the close childhood association tends to produce, the Westermark effect that the Israeli kibbutz studies documented in the 20th century. The argument that the canon law's extension of the prohibition to the seventh degree served the social benefit of the exogamous marriage was an argument that the Fourth Lateran Council's reduction of the prohibition to the fourth degree implicitly acknowledged the limits of. The seventh degree was too far for the specific social benefit argument to sustain, because the social benefit of the exogamous marriage was achieved at the first or second degree, not at the seventh. The reduction to the fourth degree was the Council's specific recognition that the extension of the prohibition beyond the range where the social benefit argument was convincing had produced the administrative burden of the excessive dispensation requests without producing the social benefit that the theological argument claimed to serve. The Augustinian tradition's contribution to the consanguinity theology was the specific argument about the extension of charity, the love that the Christian was commanded to extend to all people, that the endogamous marriage prevented. Augustine argued that the marriage of the cousin concentrated the specific love of the family on itself, reinforcing the bonds between the people already bonded, rather than extending the bonds outward to the people who were currently strangers. The exogamous marriage was the institution that extended the family's love outward, creating the new bonds with the new family that the Christian's obligation to the universal charity was expressed through in the specific institution of the marriage. This is a beautiful argument, and it is also, if examined carefully, a somewhat impractical one. The universal extension of charity was a theological ideal, and the specific marriage practices of the medieval world were not typically organized around the theological ideal of the universal charity. But the argument illuminates the specific theological vision that the canon law's consanguinity prohibition was embedded in. The vision of the Christian community as the specific, institutionalized form of the universal human brotherhood, with the marriage as the institution that built the bridges between the separate families and thereby constructed the universal community from the local materials of the specific kinship group. The theological argument was genuine. The canonical system that the theological argument justified was also simultaneously the financial machine and the political tool that the Church's institutional interests required. Both of these things were true at the same time, about the same institution, operated by the same people. The medieval Church was capable of genuine theological insight and genuine institutional corruption operating simultaneously through the same mechanisms, and the honest assessment of the consanguinity system requires acknowledging both. Chapter 13, The Modern Mirror. what the medieval consanguinity situation looks like from here. The cousin marriage is not medieval. The specific modern assumption that the cousin marriage is the characteristic practice of the past, the specific thing that the progress of civilization has moved the human community away from, the sign of the backward and the isolated that the modern world has superseded, is the assumption that the global demographic data comprehensively refutes. Approximately 1 billion people alive today are the children of first or second cousin marriages. In large parts of South Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa, the cousin marriage remains the preferred marriage form, practiced not as the survival of the pre-modern, but as the specific, rational, culturally embedded practice of the communities that have evaluated its benefits and its costs, and found it preferable to the alternatives. The benefits of the cousin marriage, in the specific contexts where it is practiced and preferred, are the specific benefits that the medieval nobility and the medieval village community both understood, and that the modern anthropological analysis has confirmed. The cousin marriage keeps the family property within the family. It creates alliances with the known family rather than the unknown outsider. It matches two people whose families have already negotiated the specific terms of their relationship over the course of the generation of the parents' friendship and the children's growing up together. It is in the specific communities where the extended family is the primary social and economic unit, the marriage form that the extended family's logic recommends. The costs of the cousin marriage, the specific genetic costs that the medieval genetics discussion was gesturing toward with the wrong mechanism, and that the modern genetics has confirmed with the right one, are the costs that the modern public health discussion of the cousin marriage in the UK and other Western countries has brought into the contemporary debate. The specific risk of the cousin marriage for the offspring, the elevated probability of the recessive genetic condition, the increased risk of the birth defect, the specific reproductive health implications of the elevated inbreeding coefficient, is the risk that the public health community communicates to the communities that practice the cousin marriage in the modern Western context. The communication of this risk is the specific modern version of the medieval church's canonical prohibition. The institutional intervention in the marriage practices of the population, justified by the genuine concern for the biological welfare of the offspring, operating through the specific authority available to the institution in its specific historical moment. The medieval church's authority was canonical. The modern public health authority is epidemiological. Both are operating on the same basic concern, using different tools in different institutional contexts, with the same imperfect effectiveness. The modern legal status of cousin marriage varies considerably across the world's legal jurisdictions, and the specific variation illuminates the specific ways in which the biological, the cultural, the legal, and the moral considerations interact in the contemporary management of the question that the medieval canon law attempted to address through the consanguinity rules. In the United States, first cousin marriage is legal in approximately half the states and prohibited in the other half. In the United Kingdom, it is legal. In most European countries, it is legal but relatively rare. In most Middle Eastern and South Asian countries, it is legal and common. In China, it is prohibited. The specific distribution of the legal positions and the specific cultural attitudes that the legal positions reflect is the map of the different societies, different answers to the same question that the medieval canon law addressed. There is no single modern consensus on the cousin marriage, in the way that there was no single medieval consensus. There was the canon law, and there was the practice, and the gap between them was the specific negotiated space in which the actual behavior occurred. The genetic counseling that the modern medical system offers to couples who are contemplating the cousin marriage is the specific individualized version of the risk assessment that the medieval canon law applied as the categorical rule. The genetic counselor assesses the specific couple's specific genetic risk, the specific family history of recessive conditions, the specific degree of relatedness, the specific genetic landscape of the particular families involved, and provides the specific, personalized guidance that the categorical rule cannot provide. This is in the specific tools it uses and the specific information it generates, a more sophisticated approach than the canon law's seventh degree prohibition. But it is doing the same thing, providing the institutional guidance on the marriage decision that the society has decided requires the institutional intervention. The Habsburg family tree is still the shorthand for the spectacular case. Carlos II is still the specific human face that the extreme end of the spectrum wears. But the ordinary case, the first cousin marriage of two people in a small, isolated community, whose children are somewhat more likely than the children of unrelated parents to carry the doubled recessive allele of the specific condition that runs in their family, is the ordinary case that the medieval village's consanguinity situation produced in its specific thousands of specific households, and that the modern genetic research is still assessing the specific public health implications of. The mirror that the medieval consanguinity situation holds up to the modern world is the mirror of the specific recurring human tendency to manage the biological and social complexities of the marriage within the kin group through the institutional intervention of whatever authority the particular moment provides. The specific authority changes, the specific mechanism changes, the specific rules change, the specific human tendency toward the marriage within the familiar, the known, the already related, and the specific institutional response to that tendency does not change. Chapter 14. The language. How consanguinity shaped the medieval vocabulary of kinship. The words were precise. The medieval vocabulary of kinship, the specific, elaborate terminology that the consanguinity rules required for the precise description of the family relationships that the canon law regulated, was the vocabulary of the institution that needed to be exact about the relationships it was governing, because the specific degree of the relationship was the specific fact that determined whether the marriage was canonical or prohibited, permissible or requiring dispensation, valid or invalid. The English language's kinship vocabulary is, by the standards of the medieval canon law's requirements, imprecise. The word cousin covers a vast range of actual genealogical relationships. The first cousin, the second cousin, the cousin once removed, the various degrees of cousinhood that the common ancestor's distance from the present generation produces. In ordinary modern English usage, cousin typically means first cousin, but the historical usage was more expansive, and the specific degree of the cousinhood was not captured by the word itself, but required the additional specification of the degree. The Latin of the canon law was more precise. The sobrinus and the consobrinus distinguished the different types of cousinhood. The patruellus was the father's brother's child. The emittenus was the father's sister's child. The consobrinus was the mother's sister's child. The matruellus was the mother's brother's child. These distinctions, which the modern English vocabulary has largely collapsed into the single word cousin, were the specific vocabulary of the system that needed to know exactly which cousin you were talking about, because the exact identity of the common ancestor and the exact number of generations back to that ancestor was the specific calculation that the consanguinity degree required. The affinity terminology was equally precise. The sotsier was the father-in-law. The socras was the mother-in-law. The levair was the husband's brother. The gloss was the husband's sister. The vitricus was the stepfather. The noverca was the stepmother. These were the specific relationships created by marriage rather than blood, and the canon law's extension of the consanguinity prohibition to cover affinity relationships required the specific vocabulary for the affinity relationships, as the consanguinity vocabulary required the specific vocabulary for the blood relationships. The development of this vocabulary was the development of the canon law itself, the specific precision of the terminology growing with the specific precision of the rules that the terminology was designed to describe. The 12th century canonists who were systematizing the canon law, Gratian and his successors, the glossators who built the specific tradition of the canonical science on the foundation that Gratian's decretum provided, were simultaneously developing the legal system and the vocabulary that the legal system required. The vernacular languages of medieval Europe developed their own consanguinity vocabularies alongside the Latin canonical terminology, and the specific development of the vernacular vocabulary was the development of the language's capacity to describe the social reality that the canon law was regulating. The specific words for the specific degrees of kinship in the medieval French, the medieval English, the medieval German, the words that the ordinary person used to describe their family relationships, as distinct from the Latin of the canon lawyer, were the words that the specific social reality of the family, with its specific structure of the blood relationships and the marriage relationships, required. The word uncle, from the Latin avunculus, the mother's brother, was the specific term that the Latin tradition preserved in the English through the French oncle of the Norman influence, and its specific meaning, the mother's brother, distinct from the father's brother, who was in Latin the patruus, was the specific precision that the Latin kinship vocabulary had, and that the English uncle/aunt pair collapsed. In modern English, the uncle is the uncle regardless of which side of the family he is on. In classical Latin, the specific side of the family was encoded in the specific word. The loss of this precision in the modern English vocabulary is the loss of the specific social and legal importance that the distinction between the maternal and the paternal uncle once had. The specific difference in the inheritance system between the maternal and the paternal kin, the specific difference in the feudal obligation between the maternal and the paternal uncle, the specific difference in the consanguinity calculation between the relationship through the father's side and the relationship through the mother's side that the canon law sometimes required. The genealogical vocabulary of the medieval world was the vocabulary of the institution of the family, with its specific structure of the blood relationship and the marriage relationship and the canonical relationship, regulated by the specific rules of the canon law, and administered by the specific officials of the ecclesiastical and secular legal systems. The precision of the vocabulary was the precision of the system's need for the exact description of the exact relationship, because the exact relationship was the specific fact on which the canonical determination turned. Chapter 15. The Long Shadow. How the medieval consanguinity rules shaped the world we live in. The rules didn't disappear. The specific institutional history of the medieval consanguinity system, the 7 centuries of the canon law's development, the dispensation machine, the annulment jurisprudence, the theological arguments, the Habsburg consequences, did not end cleanly with the Reformation or the Enlightenment or any of the other historical moments that the narrative of modernity identifies as the points at which the medieval gave way to the modern. The consanguinity rules did not end. They transformed. They moved. They were translated from the canonical language of the medieval church into the secular legal language of the modern state, from the ecclesiastical court into the civil registry, from the dispensation petition into the public health advisory. And in the translation, they carried the specific shape of the medieval thinking about the blood relationship into the institutional forms that the modern world uses to manage the same fundamental questions. The specific inheritance of the medieval consanguinity thinking in the modern legal system is the inheritance that most people walk past without recognizing it for what it is. The prohibited degrees of the modern civil marriage law, the specific list of the relationships within which the modern state prohibits marriage, encoded in the family law statutes of virtually every legal system in the world, are the direct descendants of the medieval canon laws, consanguinity, and affinity tables. The specific relationships prohibited, the specific logic of the prohibition, the specific extension from the blood relationship to the marriage-created relationship. All of these carry the shape of the canonical thinking into the secular code. The English Marriage Act of 1835, the specific piece of Victorian legislation that codified the prohibited degrees of marriage in the English civil law, was essentially the Leviticus list plus the canonical affinity extensions translated from the Church's authority into the Parliament's authority. The specific relationships prohibited were the relationships that the medieval canon law had prohibited, now enforced by the state rather than the Church, but carrying the same underlying logic and the same underlying list. When the English Parliament subsequently modified the prohibited degrees, most notably in the Marriage, Prohibited Degrees of Relationship, Act of 1986, which permitted the marriage of certain step relations, it was modifying the medieval inheritance, not replacing it. The foundation remained. The genetic counseling profession, the specific modern medical specialty that advises couples on the inherited disease risks of their proposed union, is the secular scientific successor to the canonical consanguinity assessment, and its practitioners are doing what the medieval canon lawyers were doing, but with the tools of the molecular biology rather than the tools of the genealogical calculation. The genetic counselor who tells the first cousin couple that their children have a somewhat elevated risk of the specific recessive condition that runs in their shared family history is delivering the specific, individualized version of the risk information that the medieval consanguinity prohibition was attempting to encode in the categorical rule. The categorical rule and the individualized assessment are different tools for the same underlying concern, and the shift from the one to the other is the shift from the institutional management of the risk at the population level to the individual management of the risk at the personal level. The specific transition from the medieval to the modern in the specific management of the biological consequences of the kin marriage. The medieval church managed the risk by prohibiting the category. The modern medicine manages the risk by assessing the specific case. Both are attempting to address the real biological phenomenon of the inbreeding depression. The difference is the precision of the tool and the locus of the authority. The anthropological record of the cousin marriage preference in the specific cultures that maintain it is the record of the specific persistence of the social logic that the medieval consanguinity rules were attempting to redirect. The communities of the Middle East and South Asia that maintain the first cousin marriage as the preferred marriage form are the communities in which the extended family's social and economic functions remain the primary functions of the social organization. The communities in which the marriage within the kin group makes the same specific social and economic sense that it made for the medieval nobility consolidating the land, and the alliances and the medieval village preserving the social coherence of the small community. The medieval canon law's attempt to redirect the cousin marriage preference was the attempt of an institution that believed the exogamous marriage served the universal community's interests better than the endogamous marriage served the particular family's interests. And the persistence of the cousin marriage preference in the communities where the extended family remains, the primary social unit, is the specific evidence that the preference the canon law was trying to redirect was not a mere custom or a mere tradition, but a rational response to a specific social and economic reality. The communities in which the extended family has ceased to be the primary social and economic unit, the communities of the modern, Western world, where the nuclear family and the state have replaced the extended family and the kin group as the primary institutions of the social organization, are the communities in which the cousin marriage preference has largely disappeared, not primarily because of the canonical prohibition or the legal restriction, but because the specific social and economic logic that made the cousin marriage the preferred form has been superseded by the specific social and economic reality that makes the exogamous marriage equally or more rational. This is the long shadow that the medieval consanguinity debate casts on the modern world. Not the shadow of the specific rules which have been modified and translated and partially discarded, but the shadow of the underlying question that the rules were attempting to answer. What is the right relationship between the biological reality of the blood relationship, the social reality of the family as the primary unit of the human organization, and the institutional interest of the larger community in directing the family's marriage practices in the direction of the broader social benefit? The medieval church answered this question with the canon law and the dispensation system and the theological arguments of Aquinas and Augustine and the practical machinery of the curial bureaucracy. The modern state answers it with the civil marriage law and the genetic counseling and the public health research and the family law statute. The answer is different in its specific content and its specific authority and its specific tools. The question is the same. The specific families that the medieval consanguinity system shaped, the dynasties whose genealogies loop back on themselves in the specific way that the Habsburg diagram most dramatically illustrates, the village families whose consanguinity was managed by the bishop's retrospective dispensation, the noble families whose strategic cousin marriages built the specific network of alliances that the political system required. These families are the ancestors of the contemporary world's population in the specific, literal, biological sense of the people from whose bodies the current generation descended. The specific genetic heritage of the medieval consanguinity system is present in the genomes of the people alive today. The specific recessive alleles that the systematic cousin marriages of the medieval period concentrated in the specific family lines, and that the exogamous marriages of the subsequent centuries diluted back into the general population. The Habsburg prognathism, the specific jaw malformation that the Habsburg inbreeding intensified to its most extreme expression in Carlos II, is still detectable in attenuated form in the descendants of the Habsburg line who survive in the European aristocratic families of the present. The specific genetic legacy of the medieval consanguinity practices is not the legacy of the past. It is the legacy of the present, carried in the specific molecules of the specific people. The medieval consanguinity rules were one of the most consequential institutional interventions in the reproductive biology of a human population that the historical record documents. Over the 7 centuries of the medieval period, the canon law's specific prohibitions, imperfectly enforced, selectively applied, regularly circumvented, expensively dispensed, nevertheless shaped the marriage practices of the European population in the specific direction of the greater outbreeding than the purely endogamous preference would have produced. The specific genetic consequence of this direction, the greater genetic diversity of the European population relative to the populations where the endogamous preference was not institutionally challenged, is the specific population-level biological legacy of the medieval canon law's consanguinity intervention. The medieval church did not know this. The theologians who argued for the exogamous marriage on the grounds of the social benefit and the extension of charity and the appropriate management of the family effect were not arguing for the greater genetic diversity of the European population. The genetics did not exist as a concept. The mechanism was invisible, but the effect was real. And the effect was the specific, long-running, population-level consequence of the institutional intervention in the marriage practices of an entire civilization. The specific demonstration that the institutional rules about who can marry whom, enforced with the imperfect, negotiated, selective enforcement of the actual institution rather than the perfect mechanical enforcement of the theoretical rule, nevertheless shape the biological and social reality of the population they govern over the long run of the centuries. This is the long shadow of the medieval consanguinity rules, not the shadow of the specific cases, the Habsburgs, the annulment of Eleanor, the crisis of Henry VIII, but the shadow of the institutional intervention at the population level, the specific shaping of the European population's marriage practices, and therefore its genetic heritage over the centuries of the medieval period, the consequence of which the present generation carries in its DNA without knowing it and without needing to know it. The rules are still there in the modified, translated, secularized form of the civil marriage law. The questions are still there in the specific, contemporary form of the genetic counseling appointment and the public health research paper and the family law statute. The blood is still there in the specific molecular form of the genome that carries the specific legacy of the specific marriages of the specific people who lived and loved and negotiated the specific rules of their specific moment. The medieval consanguinity system is over. The medieval consanguinity system is not over. Both of these things are true. The family tree goes back further than you think. Conclusion: the blood that bound. What consanguinity in the Middle Ages tells us about power, family, and the management of the human community. The family was never simple. This is the conclusion that the entire history of medieval consanguinity points toward, not the romantic conclusion, not the grim conclusion, but the specific, honest conclusion that the detailed examination of the rules and the cases and the dispensations and the annulments and the Habsburgs and the village couples and the theological arguments and the genealogical vocabularies produces when you look at them together and ask what they collectively mean. The family was the medieval world's primary social, economic, and political unit, the specific institution around which the management of the land, the transmission of the wealth, the formation of the alliances, and the organization of the labor were all structured. The marriage was the family's specific instrument of reproduction and alliance formation. the mechanism through which the family perpetuated itself biologically and extended itself socially, converting the separate family into the allied families through the specific legal and sacramental bond that the medieval marriage created. The consanguinity rules were the medieval church's specific intervention in this process. The attempt to regulate the marriage in the specific direction of the exogamous, the outward reaching, the alliance forming, rather than the endogamous, the inward turning, the property preserving. The rules said, do not marry within the family. Reach outward, form new bonds. Build the universal Christian community from the specific materials of the specific kin group's willingness to give its marriageable members to the families that the marriage would connect. The rules were the ideal. The practice was the negotiation. The dispensation system was the specific institution of the negotiation. The mechanism through which the ideal and the reality reached the accommodation that the medieval world required, because the ideal was genuinely incompatible with the reality in specific, predictable, unavoidable ways. The nobility needed the cousin marriage to consolidate the alliances that the political system required. The village needed the neighbor marriage, because the neighbor was the only available candidate within the practical constraint of the walking distance. The dynasty needed the close marriage to maintain the genealogical purity that the dynastic logic demanded, and that the limited pool of appropriate candidates made essentially unavoidable. The dispensation system was the canonical acknowledgement of these realities. The Church's specific recognition that the rules could not be universally enforced without producing consequences that the Church was not prepared to produce, wrapped in the institutional form of the permission that maintained the appearance of the rule's authority while accommodating the reality of its consistent violation. The Habsburgs are the extreme case. The specific family that pursued the dynastic marriage logic to its furthest biological conclusion and paid the specific biological price that the conclusion required. Carlos II is the specific human face of the extreme case, the king who was the final product of the strategy that his ancestors had begun, bearing in his person the accumulated biological consequence of the 6 generations of systematic cousin marriage that had produced the dynasty he was inheriting and unable to continue. The Habsburgs are the medieval consanguinity story's most dramatic chapter, but they are not its only chapter or even its most important one. The most important chapter is the chapter of the ordinary village couple who needed the retrospective dispensation for the consanguinity that neither of them had known about, and who received it from the bishop who weighed the canonical violation against the human reality of the 14 years and the 7 children, and found the human reality more compelling. The most important chapter is the chapter of the minor noble's daughter, whose marriage to her second cousin was enabled by the dispensation that the family had scraped together the fee to obtain, and who lived and died in that marriage, without the historical record thinking her important enough to note. The most important chapter is the chapter of the family that could not afford the dispensation, and whose priest was sensible enough not to investigate too carefully, and whose consanguinity was never discovered because the bans were announced and nobody chose to challenge them. These are the ordinary chapters of the ordinary history of the consanguinity rules, the history of the rules that were real, and the compliance that was negotiated, and the enforcement that was selective, and the specific human situations that the rigid rule was always being bent to accommodate. This is not the history of the rule failing. This is the history of the rule working in the specific, imperfect, negotiated way that the medieval institution always worked, as the framework within which the specific human situations were managed, rather than the mechanical system that produced identical outcomes, regardless of the specific human circumstances. The medieval consanguinity system was simultaneously the theological vision of the universal Christian community, built through the exogamous marriage, the financial machine of the dispensation revenue, the political tool of the papal leverage over the dynastic marriage market, the biological intuition about the harm of the excessive inbreeding dressed in the wrong mechanism of the humoral theory, and the pastoral response to the specific human situations that the rigid rule was always inadequate to address. All of these things were true. None of them cancels the others. The blood relationship is the most fundamental social bond. The specific, biological, emotionally charged connection between the people who share the ancestry that the human community has always recognized as the foundation of the family. The consanguinity rules were the medieval world's specific attempt to manage that bond, to direct it, to limit it, to extend it outward in the direction of the universal community, rather than allowing it to fold inward on itself, in the direction of the endogamous family that married within and built walls rather than bridges. The attempt was imperfect. The management was negotiated. The rules were manipulated. The dispensation was bought and sold. The annulment was manufactured. The genealogy was searched until the prohibited relationship was found, or until the search was abandoned. And the families continued. The marriages happened. The children were born. The dynasties rose and fell. The village couples grew old in the marriages that the bishop had retrospectively regularized. The blood kept flowing, as it always had, as it always will. That is what the consanguinity rules tell us about the medieval world. And that is what the medieval world tells us about ourselves.